What happens when the most feared Alpha King in the realm finds a lowly servant girl curled up in the dirt alongside his deadliest disease-ridden beasts? She wasn't supposed to survive the night. Instead, she commanded them. And every morning, the king returned to watch her do it again. The winter of 1348 brought more than just freezing winds to the stone corridors of Castle Ethelgard. It brought a plague. They called it the blood rot. It did not strike the human servants, nor did it touch the livestock. It specifically targeted the Lycan elite, the massive, feral beasts that served as the true power behind King Alaric's throne. Alaric was a ruler forged in iron and blood, an alpha whose sheer presence demanded submission. Yet for all his martial brilliance and terrifying strength, he was utterly powerless against the sickness ravaging his pack. His most prized warwolves, beasts that stood as tall as warhorses and possessed a terrifying sentience, were rotting from the inside out. They became rabid, turning on their handlers, their fur falling out in bloody patches, their golden eyes clouding with a milky, feverish madness. The royal physicians, led by the arrogant Lord Percival, declared the disease airborne and incurable. By royal decree, the sickest wolves were banished to the deepest, darkest wing of the royal stables, a stone-walled dungeon of a barn, known as the Iron Stalls. They were left there to die in the freezing damp, heavily chained, and completely isolated. Anyone caught entering the Iron Stalls was to be hanged, for fear they would spread the plague to the rest of the kingdom. But Rowena did not care about Lord Percival's decrees. Rowena was a shadow in Ethelgard, a mere kitchen maid tasked with scrubbing the soot from the massive hearths. However, before her father, Finnick had been falsely accused of theft and banished. He had been the greatest herbalist in the northern reaches. From him, Rowena had learned the old ways, the properties of wild mountain flora, the secrets of blood binding, and the silent language of beasts. She knew with absolute certainty that the wolves did not have the blood rot. It began on a moonless Tuesday. The howls echoing from the Iron Stalls were filled with an agonizing despair that tore at Rowena's heart. Waiting until the castle guard changed shifts at the midnight bell, she slipped out of the scullery, her threadbare cloak wrapped tightly around her shivering frame. Hidden beneath her arm was a basket, heavily laden with forbidden supplies, crushed silver-leaf wild marrow root, fresh charcoal, and heavy linen bandages. When Rowena breached the heavy oak doors of the Iron Stalls, the stench nearly knocked her backward. It was a suffocating mix of copper decay and unwashed animal. In the dim moonlight filtering through the high-barred windows, she saw them. 7 massive wolves chained to the heavy stone pillars, thrashing in fevered agony. The largest of them all was Fenrir, the king's personal war beast. He was a creature of absolute nightmares, covered in coarse midnight black fur, now matted with dark, tar-like blood. As Rowena took a cautious step forward, Fenrir's head snapped toward her. A guttural snarl rattled the loose stones of the stable, vibrating through the soles of Rowena's worn leather boots. He lunged, only to be jerked back by the thick iron chains. A normal girl would have fled. Rowena dropped to her knees in the filthy straw. She did not make eye contact, a direct challenge to a Lycan, but instead bared her throat slightly in a gesture of absolute submission. She reached into her basket and pulled out a burning bundle of dried lavender and pale sage, letting the sweet, heavy smoke fill the freezing air. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the rattling chains. "I know it burns, but I am not here to hurt you." Slowly, agonizingly, she crawled forward. Fenrir snapped his massive jaws mere inches from her face, the hot metallic stench of his breath washing over her. She didn't flinch. With trembling hands, she took a thick slab of raw venison, laced with charcoal and crushed marrow root, a powerful purgative, and slid it across the stone floor. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of sitting in the freezing dirt, murmuring old lullabies her father had taught her, ignoring the terrifying snaps and growls of the apex predators surrounding her. One by one, the smoke and her calming presence broke through their fevered panic. Fenrir ate the meat. The others followed. Once the beasts were sedated by the herbs, Rowena set to work. She washed their seeping wounds with an astringent of silver leaf, her bare hands stained with their toxic blood. As she cleaned Fenrir's gums, she saw the undeniable proof, a dark black line running along the base of his fangs. It wasn't a plague. It was wolfsbane ash. Someone was slowly, methodically poisoning the Alpha King's pack. Exhausted, freezing, and physically drained from the sheer adrenaline of surviving the night, Rowena couldn't make it back to the kitchens before dawn. Her body simply gave out. Seeking the only warmth available in the freezing stables, she crawled into the thick, matted fur of the massive black wolf. Fenrir, a beast known to tear armored men to shreds, simply shifted his massive weight, wrapped his tail over her shivering legs, and rested his heavy chin near her head. Rowena slept in the dirt with the monsters. King Alaric did not sleep. The slow destruction of his pack felt like a physical tearing of his own soul. Every morning, just before the sun breached the horizon, he walked the perimeter of the iron stalls alone. It was a macabre ritual, a silent mourning for the beasts that had fought beside him to secure the borders of Ethelgard. He expected to hear the dying rattles of his wolves. Instead, on the 4th morning of the quarantine, he heard the soft, steady rhythm of human breathing. Alaric pushed open the heavy wooden doors, his golden eyes adjusting instantly to the gloom. He froze. His hand dropped to the jeweled hilt of his broadsword. There, curled in the blood-stained straw, was a girl. She was small, dressed in the drab, soot-stained wool of the lowest serving caste, her face smeared with ash and dirt. But what stopped the king's heart was not her presence. It was where she rested. She was asleep, her head pillowed on Fenrir's massive flank. The great black wolf was awake, his golden eyes locked onto Alaric. When Alaric took a step forward, an impossible sound filled the stable. Fenrir, his own beast, his soul-bound wolf, bared his fangs and let out a low warning rumble. At him. The king. The wolf was protecting the servant girl from his own alpha. The growl woke Rowena. She jolted upright, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She looked from the snarling jaws of the wolf to the towering, broad-shouldered figure of the Alpha King silhouetted in the doorway. He wore heavy furs over dark leather armor, his face an unreadable mask of hardened angles and terrifying authority. "Mercy, your grace." Rowena gasped, throwing herself forward and pressing her forehead into the filthy straw, expecting a sword to cleave her neck in two. "I meant no treason." Alaric stepped into the stable, the sheer dominance of his aura forcing the other wolves to lower their heads. He stared down at the trembling girl. "You have broken a royal quarantine." His voice was like grinding stones, deep and lethal. "You sleep with plague-ridden beasts. By my own law, I should burn you in this courtyard." Rowena squeezed her eyes shut. She had nothing to lose. "They do not have the rot, sire." Silence stretched thick and suffocating. "Excuse me," Alaric demanded, his tone dangerously soft. Rowena pushed herself up to her knees, keeping her gaze cast downward respectfully, but her voice steadied. "The royal physicians are fools, your grace. The beasts are not diseased. They are being poisoned." Before Alaric could react, Rowena turned to Fenrir. "May I?" she whispered to the beast. The giant wolf huffed, submitting to her touch. She pried his massive jaws open. "Look, Your Grace, the black line along the gums, the heavy shedding, the fever. This is not the blood rot. This is chronic ingestion of wolfsbane ash mixed with pulverized glass to make it absorb into the bloodstream." Alaric knelt beside her, his large, scarred hand brushing past hers to inspect the wolf's mouth. His golden eyes flared with a sudden, violent realization. The symptoms matched perfectly. He looked at the bandages she had applied, smelling the faint scent of marrow root and silver leaf. "You did this?" he asked, looking at the poultices. "You treated them?" "Yes, sire. The marrow root purges the poison. They are weak, but the madness is breaking. They will live." Alaric stood slowly, his mind racing. If the wolves were being poisoned, it meant there was a traitor within his inner circle. Only the highest-ranking nobles and his personal beastmasters had access to the wolves' feed. Lord Percival had been the one pushing hardest to have the wolves incinerated, destroying the evidence. "What is your name?" the king asked, looking down at the soot-stained girl who had just handed him the key to saving his kingdom. "Rowena, sire. Listen to me carefully, Rowena." Alaric commanded, stepping closer, his presence entirely consuming her vision. "You were never here. You know nothing of poison. You are to return to the kitchens." Rowena's heart sank. She had expected to be thrown in the dungeon, or perhaps rewarded, but to be dismissed entirely. But the wolves— "Will be treated," Alaric interrupted smoothly. "By you. Every night you will come here. You will continue to heal them, and you will tell no one. If Lord Percival or anyone else discovers what you are doing, they will kill you before I can stop them. Do you understand?" Rowena swallowed hard, looking up into the king's intense, predatory gaze. "Yes, Your Grace." That morning marked the beginning of a dangerous secret life. By day, Rowena was a ghost scrubbing pots and taking abuse from the head cook. But by night she was the queen of the iron stalls. She brewed her remedies in secret, smuggling them in beneath her skirts, and every morning, just before dawn, King Alaric would come. At first he came merely to check on the progress of his beasts. He would stand in the shadows, his arms crossed over his massive chest, watching as Rowena fearlessly navigated the deadly predators. He watched as she laughed softly when a timber wolf nuzzled her neck or scolded Fenrir when he snapped at a younger pup. Alaric had never seen anyone handle lichens with such gentle authority, not with dominance and whips, but with empathy and respect. Slowly the dynamic shifted. Alaric stopped standing by the door. He began to join her in the straw. He would help her lift the heavier wolves, his massive strength making her delicate work easier. They sat together in the quiet, freezing hours of the dawn, sharing a single heavy wool blanket while they waited for the herbs to take effect. "Where did a scullery maid learn the anatomy of a lichen?" Alaric asked one morning, his deep voice keeping the chilling draught at bay. He handed her a flask of spiced wine he had smuggled from his own private cellars. Rowena took a sip, the warmth blooming in her chest. "My father was Finnick of the northern reaches. He taught me that every creature, no matter how terrifying, feels pain, and pain makes monsters of us all." Alaric looked at her, truly looked at her. Beneath the soot and exhaustion, she possessed a quiet, unyielding beauty. Her spirit was forged of something far stronger than the steel of his swords. He found himself lingering longer each morning, risking discovery by his own guards, just to spend another few moments in the quiet sanctuary of the stables with her. He was an alpha king who carried the weight of a brutal kingdom, but with Rowena in the dirt and the dark he could just breathe. But the poisonings did not stop. Despite Rowena's nightly interventions, new wolves in the outer stables began falling ill. The traitor was escalating their efforts. Tensions within the royal court reached a boiling point. Lord Percival demanded a purge, claiming the king's refusal to burn the beasts was angering the gods and causing a famine in the southern provinces. Whispers of rebellion began to echo through the great halls of Ethelgard. One terrible morning, Rowena arrived at the iron stalls to find the heavy oak doors unlocked. Her heart plummeted. She rushed inside, dropping her basket of supplies. The wolves were quiet. Too quiet. Stepping into the dim light, she gasped. Standing in the center of the stables, flanked by 4 heavily armored royal guards, was Lord Percival. In his hand, he held the half-empty pouch of silver leaf Rowena had hidden beneath a loose stone the night before. Percival turned a cruel, triumphant smile stretching across his gaunt face. Well, well. It seems we have found the source of the dark magic blighting our noble beasts. He sneered, gesturing to the guards. Seize the witch. The king will have his burning after all. The rough, gauntleted hands of the royal guards seized Rowena, hauling her off the stone floor. Her knees scraped against the jagged flagstones, but she did not cry out. She stared into the cold, calculating eyes of Lord Percival Royce. "You are making a grave mistake, my lord," Rowena said, her voice shaking but her chin held high. "I am purging the sickness, not causing it. If you stop the treatments now, the pack will die." "That," Percival sneered, leaning in close so she could smell the sour wine on his breath, "is entirely the point, you filthy little rat." The revelation hit Rowena like a physical blow. It wasn't just blind panic or medical ignorance driving the physician. It was a calculated assassination of the king's military might. Percival turned to the guards, his voice rising in faux authority. "Take this witch to the lower bailey. Rouse the executioner. We shall burn her as the sun rises to cleanse this castle of her dark rot." "You cannot do this without the king's decree," Rowena shouted, thrashing against the heavy iron grips of the soldiers. "The king is asleep," Percival replied smoothly, "and by the time he wakes, the kingdom will be saved from a plague-bringing hag. Move her." They dragged her through the freezing mud of the courtyard. The sky above Ethelgard was bruised with the dark purples and greys of early dawn. Servants and early-rising men-at-arms stopped in their tracks, murmuring as they saw the head physician marching a blood-stained scullery maid toward the heavy wooden pyre that sat permanently in the center of the bailey. Rowena's eyes darted around frantically. On the upper balconies overlooking the courtyard, she saw him, Duke Leonpold Harrington. He was the wealthiest lord in the southern provinces, a man who had long openly criticized King Alaric's reliance on the Lycan forces. He stood wrapped in expensive furs, watching the spectacle with a satisfied, predatory smirk. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in Rowena's mind. The crushed glass, the rare wolfsbane ash, it wasn't cheap. It required immense wealth and trade connections to smuggle into the royal keep. Harrington was the financier. Percival was the hand that delivered it. "Tie her to the post," Percival commanded as they reached the pyre. Captain Gideon Croft, the commander of the Bailey Guard, stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his broadsword. "My Lord Royce, this is highly irregular. The king must sign a writ of execution." "Captain Croft, this woman was caught performing blood magic in the iron stalls," Percival bellowed, playing to the gathering crowd. "She has poisoned the king's beasts. Will you let her curse spread to the women and children of this keep while we wait for ink to dry on a parchment?" The crowd muttered in fear. Captain Croft hesitated, stepping back. The guards shoved Rowena roughly against the rough-hewn timber of the post, looping thick, scratchy hemp rope around her wrists and waist. The executioner approached, carrying a blazing pitch-pine torch. Rowena closed her eyes. She thought of her father Finnick. She thought of the quiet, stolen moments in the dark with a king who treated her not as a servant, but as an equal. Then a sound shattered the morning air. It was not a howl. It was the sound of solid oak splintering, followed by the screeching snap of thick iron chains giving way. The heavy double doors of the iron stalls located at the far end of the courtyard violently exploded outward. Wood rained down on the cobblestones. The crowd screamed and scattered. Through the dust and debris stepped Fenrir. He was no longer a hunched, fever-ridden victim. Though his coat was still patchy, his muscles were coiled, his golden eyes burning with terrifying clarity and absolute lethal intent. Behind him, the other 6 wolves emerged from the shadows, their teeth bared, dropping into hunting crouches. Percival stumbled backward, his face draining of all color. "Shoot them!" he shrieked at the archers on the battlements. "Shoot the beasts!" Before a single arrow could be knocked, a voice boomed across the courtyard, carrying the sheer concussive force of thunder. "Hold your fire!" King Alaric strode into the bailey. He was not wearing his crown or his heavy royal furs. He was dressed in a simple linen shirt and leather breeches, wielding a massive unsheathed broadsword. His eyes were locked on Rowena tied to the pyre, and the murderous rage rolling off him was so palpable it made the guards physically step back. "Your Grace," Percival stammered, dropping to one knee. "Praise the gods you are awake. We caught the culprit. This maid, she was poisoning your beasts. We found the herbs on her person." Alaric didn't even look at the physician. He walked straight past Percival, straight through the ring of armed guards, and approached the pyre. Fenrir trotted to the king's side, pressing his massive scarred shoulder against Alaric's leg, a united front of alpha and beast. With one swift, brutal swing of his broadsword, Alaric severed the thick ropes binding Rowena. She collapsed forward, gasping straight into his waiting arm. He caught her effortlessly, tucking her against his chest. "Are you harmed?" he whispered, his voice vibrating against her ear. "Only my pride, your grace," she managed to say, clutching the fabric of his shirt. Alaric finally turned to face his court. His gaze swept over the terrified crowd, pausing deliberately on the upper balcony, where Duke Leopold Harrington suddenly looked incredibly pale. "Lord Percival," Alaric said, his voice dangerously quiet, cutting through the silence of the courtyard. "You claim this girl poisoned my wolves?" "Yes, sire, with wild marrow root and silver leaf," Percival cried out, holding up the pouch. Rowena pulled herself up, standing beside the king. "Silver leaf and marrow root are cures, Lord Royce, not poisons. A royal physician should know that." She turned her gaze up to the balcony. "But perhaps Duke Leopold Harrington knows more about the true poison. The wolfsbane ash imported last moon under the guise of silk shipments from the Harrington Merchant Guild. I saw the cargo manifests in the scullery stamped with his private seal." The courtyard erupted into gasps. Harrington turned to flee the balcony, but Alaric raised a hand. "Captain Croft, sire, seize the Duke, seal the gates. No one from the Harrington or Royce estates leaves this keep alive." The aftermath of the courtyard confrontation was swift and bloody. King Alaric was a ruler of justice, but he was also an alpha, and treason against his pack was met with zero mercy. Lord Percival Royce confessed everything in the dungeons before the torture implements were even fully heated. He outlined the entire conspiracy. Duke Harrington intended to assassinate the Lycan Guard to leave the capital defenseless, allowing his private mercenary army to storm Ethelgard and claim the throne. The execution of a lowly servant girl was supposed to be a convenient cover-up, a distraction that would enrage the public against dark magic while the real traitors slipped away. By nightfall, Duke Harrington's severed head adorned a pike on the outer gates, and Lord Percival had been hanged from the very pyre he built for Rowena. The Harrington Merchant Guild was seized its immense wealth, absorbed into the royal treasury to rebuild the provinces. But inside the highest tower of the keep, far away from the blood and politics, Rowena sat by a roaring hearth. She was no longer dressed in soot-stained wool. The king's personal attendants had drawn her a hot bath infused with rose oils, washed the grime from her hair, and dressed her in a gown of deep midnight blue velvet. Her bruised wrists were carefully wrapped in clean white silk. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Alaric stepped into the room. He looked exhausted, the weight of the day's executions heavy on his broad shoulders, but as his golden eyes landed on Rowena, the harsh lines of his face softened completely. Following closely behind him was Fenrir. The massive wolf trotted over to Rowena, nudging his wet nose under her hand, demanding affection. She smiled, scratching him behind the ears. "He listens to you more than he listens to me now." Alaric noted a faint, genuine smile touching his lips as he crossed the room. "He knows who brings the good meat," Rowena teased softly. Alaric stopped in front of her chair. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a heavy roll of parchment, sealed with the royal wax. He handed it to her. Rowena unrolled it carefully. Her breath hitched. It was a royal decree, signed by Alaric's own hand. It formally pardoned her late father Finnick of all past accusations, reinstating his noble titles, and returning the ancestral lands of the northern reaches to his sole surviving heir, Lady Rowena. "You did not have to do this, Your Grace," Rowena whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek, splashing onto the parchment. "I only did what was right." "You did what my entire court of highly paid scholars and lords failed to do," Alaric corrected, kneeling before her so that they were eye to eye. He reached out his large, calloused thumb, gently brushing the tear from her cheek. "You walked into the dark. You sat with the monsters. You saved my soul, Rowena." He took her hands in his. "The scullery maid is dead. The Lady of the Northern Reaches is reborn. But—" he hesitated, a vulnerability shining in the eyes of the most feared man in the realm. "Ethelgard still needs a healer. My pack needs a master who understands their hearts, not just their teeth." Rowena looked deeply into his golden eyes, feeling the steady, thundering rhythm of his pulse where his fingers held hers. "And what does the king need?" she asked softly. Alaric leaned in the scent of pine leather and rain enveloping her. "The king needs his Luna," he murmured right before his lips captured hers. It was a kiss of fire, and claiming a promise forged in the freezing dirt of the iron stalls, and finalized in the highest tower of the kingdom. The bond was immediate, electric, and undeniable. Fenrir let out a low, content rumble, settling down by the hearth. The next morning, when the sun rose over Ethelgard, King Alaric did not walk to the stables alone to mourn his dying beasts. He walked out onto the grand balcony overlooking his kingdom, his hand firmly holding the hand of Lady Rowena. Below them, in the sprawling courtyards, the Lycan pack ran freely, fully healed, their howls of loyalty echoing up to the sky. The realm had expected the wolves to tear the girl apart. Instead, she had tamed the beasts, unmasked the traitors, and stolen the heart of the Alpha King. Rowena had slept in the dirt with monsters only to wake up as a queen. Did you love this story? The drama, the betrayal, and the ultimate rise of a true Luna. If Rowena's bravery and King Alaric's fierce loyalty kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this epic romance with your pack, and subscribe for more thrilling, real-life inspired werewolf tales. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in the iron stalls?